So this is the final class of this, but don't worry, if you weren't here for the other classes, it's not a problem. We'll be kind of catching people up at the beginning. And then certainly the topic that we're looking at today is really perhaps the most important one of all of this small piece of text that we're looking at. So it won't be a problem. And I'm just letting people know that. All right, so we're going to go ahead and start with prayers as usual. And I believe Mary will you lead us in those? And we'll get those on the screen for everyone. Thanks, Shayla.
Taking refuge in generating bodhicitta, once in English, twice in Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye Chodan Soki Chodnampa Chachu Badu Dami Kyapsu Shin Daki Chanyan Gibe Sonam Gi Dola Benchu Sangye Dupashu Chodan Soki Chodnam La Chanchu Badu Dami Kyapsu Shin Daki Chanyan Gibe Sonam Gi Dola Penchir Sungye Druparshu. Okay, great. Thank you, Mary. Let's do a short meditation. And in this meditation, we are going to look at the topic that we were examining in the third class, again, which is this idea of generating compassion. Initially, there are three types of compassion. We'll get into this whole talk today. But the first one is really just being aware of the situation that sentient beings are in. We have to think about this certainly for ourselves, but the whole point of this is to generate compassion for all beings, for ourselves and others who are in the same predicament that we are in. So we're going to do a short reflection on that. And we're going to begin, as usual, with just a few minutes of silent meditation. No doubt each of you has a technique you already use in working with the breath, but if you need a suggestion, there's a subtle sensation that occurs around the nostrils when you're breathing in and out through the nose. You can just bring your awareness there. But if you have another way of working with the breath, you're welcome to do that. And the whole point is just to try to keep your awareness on the breath. But when you see that the mind has wandered, just gently guide the mind back to the breath. All right, so let's go ahead and begin the meditation with a few minutes in silence, and then I'll lead you in this short reflection to set our motivation for today and to review that teaching.
So now let's reflect. We have suddenly. All right, so hopefully everyone can hear me in the Gompa. Is that okay at this level? All right. All right, so let's go ahead and begin to set our motivation and reflect on compassion. So as we saw in that previous class back in December, we have to initially become aware of the suffering that we ourselves are going through and that all beings are going through in what we call this state of samsara, going from life to life, never finding true peace. This is already some level of wisdom that we can unite with our compassion. And the analogy that Master Chandrakirti uses is the idea of a bucket in a well. The well is samsara, all the various states of existence that we go into, from the ones that are at the very top, the uppermost states of existence, all the way down to great states of suffering in the bottom of the well. But we're the bucket, kind of being bound by the rope, and the rope are the causes of being in this state. Our own afflictions, delusions, ignorance, and then, of course, the karma that we create, the actions we engage in on the basis of that. But because we're bound by this rope, we never know any freedom for even a moment from the well. We never have a moment's reprieve from the state of samsara. And this is our situation, but it is a situation as well of every being in samsara. And there are many other points of analogy, but let's just reflect on that idea that us and every single sentient being in samsara are caught up under the control of these causes and conditions. Again, never knowing a moment's peace, never finding true happiness. And when we see that this is the case, we have that understanding of their suffering, but we need to unite that as well with the wisdom that sees how kind sentient beings have been to us. We need to feel some closeness towards them, to have some regard and concern for their situation. And the easiest way to do this is to see that they have been incredibly kind. Everything we have in our lives is due to the kindness of others. The food that we eat, the clothes we wear, the cars we drive, the roads we drive on, the buildings we live in. All of this comes about through the kindness of other beings. And there are many other ways we can reflect on the kindness of others. But our heart should open, recognizing that those beings have done that for us, have helped us in so many ways. And when we see that their situation is unsatisfactory, we should generate the compassion that first thinks how wonderful it would be if these beings had an end to their suffering once and for all, if they were free of the causes of that. And then strengthen that compassion by thinking, may this be so. May they be free from all suffering and all the causes of that. And then lastly, what makes it the great compassion that is the topic of Chandrakirti's text is when we think, I myself will do this for them. I will protect them from suffering and free them from all the causes of suffering. It's a very courageous mind, the mind that takes responsibility for freeing all these kind sentient beings from the causes of their suffering and helping them to attain true peace and happiness. And of course, how will we do this? This is where we generate the mind of bodhicitta. Striving to help beings in this way, we recognize that we have to develop ourselves to a greater degree. We have to become completely enlightened, a Buddha, for in that state we can then work spontaneously, effortlessly, perfectly for the welfare of all beings, continually until every one of them is freed from samsara and attains their full potential of Buddhahood. So generate that mind right now, that motivation for being here, so that everything we do becomes a cause for that result, our own enlightenment and the enlightenment of all sentient beings. And you can open your eyes fully when you're ready, and we'll begin the class. All right. So everyone's still hearing me okay? All right, good. Let me know if not, and I'll make sure I adjust my voice. Okay. So, yeah. We didn't get the ceiling speakers. We can probably go back to the, okay, let's try. We'll see if this works. Venerable Dundrup said the speakers in the ceiling were on apparently, so. Okay, testing, testing. All right, I think we're back. Good. All right, that's a little easier on my voice. So, all right. Again, welcome everyone. This class again is where we're going to wrap up this text. Let me go ahead and share the text, and I think it's nice for us to recite it. It's just a couple of verses that again are at the very beginning of this wonderful, whoops, the wrong button there. At this wonderful text that I studied in the master's program. And I remember being very inspired by these verses. And so in the first two classes, we worked with the verses that are kind of on the screen there. Let me pull that up a little bit more so we can get that all on the screen. Okay, let's go ahead and recite this together. Hearers and middling realizers of suchness are born from the kings of subduers. Buddhas are born from bodhisattvas. The mind of compassion, non-dual understanding, and the altruistic mind of enlightenment are the causes of children of conquerors. Mercy alone is seen as the seed of a conqueror's rich harvest, as water for development, and as ripening in the state of long enjoyment. Therefore, at the start, I praise compassion. So, very briefly, what we looked at in those first two classes were this first part, where we see that these various practitioners of Buddhism, what are called the hearers and middling realizers of suchness, the solitary realizers, these beings are striving for their own enlightenment or their own liberation. But they kind of arise through the teachings of a Buddha, the kings of subduers. The Buddhas give them the teachings they need to attain their state of liberation. Well, where do Buddhas come from? Buddhas are born from bodhisattvas, not literally, but bodhisattvas become Buddhas. Bodhisattvas are beings who have this mind of bodhicitta that we just meditated on, and they develop their minds all the way into Buddha. So then the question comes, well, where are bodhisattvas from? And of course, they're also called the children of conquerors, that are the children of the Buddhas in a sense, even though bodhisattvas give birth to Buddhas, Buddhas also have children who are bodhisattvas. It's a bit of a strange way to word it, but nonetheless, these bodhisattvas who become Buddhas come from three things: the mind of compassion, which is the main topic of this praise that we're looking at in this course; non-dual understanding, which is their kind of investigation into the deeper teachings on emptiness that we're going to look at briefly today; and then the altruistic mind of enlightenment, which is another term for bodhicitta. Bodhicitta, the mind that strives to become a Buddha, that is fed through the force of our compassion, and of course strengthened through the wisdom of emptiness. So those three are the causes of bodhisattvas. So we've looked at it as kind of this chain, from compassion gives rise to a bodhisattva, as well as the other causes that contribute. Those bodhisattvas become Buddhas, and then Buddhas do the work of helping other beings on their path to attain the results that they seek. Then we had this second verse that is referring to the fact that compassion is important at all three times. And see, the term here is used mercy. It's just a different translation of the Tibetan word that we use for compassion. Compassion and mercy in English aren't maybe completely interchangeable, But this compassion is seen initially as the seed, the kind of root from which everything develops. The conqueror's rich harvest that will follow is, developed from that seed. But it needs, of course, water in the middle. It needs something to nourish it. That compassion nourishes this seed of beginning the development into Buddhahood throughout the path, essentially, but especially in the middle. And then finally, in the end, it's a ripening in a state of long enjoyment in that conqueror's rich harvest. So we have this kind of causal process going on here too. At the very beginning, we need great compassion. And great compassion, by the way, is that compassion that strives to actually affect the situation of sentient beings. Not just sitting back and having compassionate wishes towards others, but saying, I'm going to roll up my sleeves and do the work that needs to be done to help sentient beings to be free from suffering. So, this great compassion is the seed that gives rise to our entire bodhisattva path. And it is necessary there, but it's also necessary throughout the path. We continually meditate on great compassion, strengthening our great compassion so that it becomes really how we act in the world, how we are in the world. And then it eventually ripens in the state of Buddhahood. And you can't become a Buddha without great compassion. But the idea is if you didn't have great compassion in the state of Buddhahood, well, then you wouldn't be benefiting sentient beings. You wouldn't be like the tree that is now in full harvest and continuing to give more and more fruit that beings can benefit from. Well, when you attain Buddhahood, you give the fruit of the Dharma and the teachings, things that are necessary for beings to develop their own minds. That's what we mean by that kind of compassion is important at the end when you attain that state. And as I said, you can't really attain that state without great compassion, but nonetheless, it plays a role throughout all three times in our path. So those are the first two sessions that we did. In the third session, we talked about what we meditated on today, which was this first type of the three types of compassion. Let me introduce these to you through going to the handout that we have. Again, the course materials are all available at TNL's website for the class for today. The first type of compassion was this one that we again examined in much more detail. I'm not going to go through quite all the detailed teaching that I did in that third class. We simply call it compassion observing sentient beings. Well, all three of these do observe sentient beings. We're going to see that come out in our text. But nonetheless, we put certain qualifications on sentient beings. In the first one, we're simply observing them in the light of their suffering and the fact that they are tormented by this. And remember, in Buddhism, this term suffering isn't really just what we normally call suffering in our culture, right? Suffering tends to be something that is painful, mental anguish, what have you. That's only the tip of the iceberg in Buddhism. We also say that there are deeper levels of, we use this term dukkha sometimes for this unsatisfactory existence that we have as well. There's the dukkha that is more obvious, those painful, mental anguish, what have you, that we experience, that we identify as suffering very easily. But then there's also the fact that even when we get something that brings pleasure, it doesn't really last, and it doesn't really do the trick. It doesn't help us to be free from, an unsatisfactory state and attain the real happiness that we seek. It only lasts for a while. And in fact, if we were to engage in some of those experiences that bring happiness for an extended period of time, they don't bring more happiness, they actually bring pain. And so this is something to be aware of in terms of a deeper level of dissatisfaction that the Buddha says we can all begin to see in our own lives, and of course in the lives of others. But then there's that third level of dukkha, where we understand that where they experience pain and they experience even unsatisfactory pleasure. Why? Because they're in a conditioned state. That's what this analogy of the bucket and the well is really to help us to understand, is that sentient beings, as long as they're under the control of the factors that bring them into samsara and that perpetuate their stay in life after life after life in this round of cyclic existence, it's going to be unsatisfactory. They're never going to know any freedom. They're never going to be outside of the well. So the idea is that when we begin to understand that deeper level of dukkha or dissatisfaction, we see that we and others are caught up in something that is totally unacceptable. And we want to do everything possible to not just remove ourselves from that, like these other practitioners that the Buddha taught for, to give them a path to their own individual liberation. We want to go to the state of Buddhahood, where we then can benefit all sentient beings, helping them to attain their potential and to be free from their suffering. That's the idea behind this first type of compassion, is to really understand clearly the wisdom teachings the Buddha gave about why we're in the predicament that we are. Of course, seeing the predicament is the first part of it. Remember, the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths, the very first one, not to rub our nose in our situation, but to make us aware of our situation and say, guess what, folks? We're really not okay. We're in this state of samsara. We're going from life to life. We're experiencing dukkha at these three levels. And the causes for that are within ourselves. No one's causing this to you. No one's outside there. We like to put the blame on others, right? Oh, my life is hell because of that person and this situation and the president and whatever, all the various things that we can point to and say that those are the things that need to be changed. We have to change ourselves. The factors that are within ourselves are what's causing us to be in this situation. Our karma that we've created through the force of our minds, and mainly through the root of ignorance that gives rise to unsatisfactory states of mind that we then buy into and keep perpetuating, and that produces karma, and thereby we continue to experience life after life. So this is the idea behind this first level of compassion, is to really get quite clearly what the Buddha says about our situation. And then, of course, to understand the last two truths, that there can be an end to that. The Buddha didn't just say, oh, guess what? You're all suffering and you're creating the causes yourself. And I hope it works out for you. He said, like, I have the solution. There is a way to be free of all this. And the fourth noble truth is the medicine, the solution we need to take to be free from all of this. It's the true path that leads to the end of all this. And of course, the path has many different facets. This is what I'm teaching on Wednesday night, is the stages of the path to enlightenment. We just began this course last month to examine all the teachings the Buddha gave that help us to develop our own minds, not just to attain our own freedom, but to go on to attain Buddhahood and to be able to help others. So there is a whole path that follows from this. These teachings are mainly about the root, compassion, which begins when we see clearly our own situation and have compassion for ourselves, but also open up to understanding everyone else's situation. So we get the fact that we're all in this same predicament. There's no fundamental difference. Yes, certain things manifesting right now in my life that are different from any of your lives, but the fundamental situation is exactly the same. So there's a universality to these teachings at this first level. So let's go back to the handout that I had on the screen very briefly, but this first one, I'll just review the definition of it very briefly. This is the fourth handout, by the way, which is mainly for this class. The definition of this first level of compassion, again, this is great compassion. All of these, they all have that aspect of wanting to protect beings from the state they're in. He calls it here observing mere sentient beings, meaning that they're just sentient beings who aren't qualified in the ways that we're going to see in the second and the third ones that we're going to look at later today. So the very first one is compassion distinguished by the wish that the observed mere sentient beings tormented by suffering that are its objects of observation, that's what we are observing, that they be free from suffering. And of course, that we take charge of helping them to do that. This is just a general definition that would be used for that. All of our three levels of compassion have that nature, though, of again observing sentient beings, but we're going to qualify those sentient beings in slightly different ways by uniting that perception that is in this first one with some wisdom teachings. That's the whole point of the title of this course, where you're trying to unite our wisdom and compassion. I might mention before we go too much further, those of you who may not have heard the other teachings, we often do refer to kind of wisdom and compassion as the two wings of a bird, right? If a bird is going to get to its destination, it'd have a really hard time with just one wing, right? You might have to get on a boat or something to get there, or a plane or something. We cannot fly with just one wing. To get to enlightenment, you need that wisdom that is going to remove all the stuff that obscures our minds, to get rid of the roots of our suffering and unsatisfactory state, the ignorance, the afflictions, and so on, and the karma built on them. You need that wisdom to cut through all of that. But if you do that, independent of compassion, there's no way you can get to the result of Buddhahood. You need this compassionate wing that is giving you the kind of force, the energy, the fuel in the tank to go the distance, to actually say, I'm going to keep developing my mind until I get to a state where I can help all sentient beings perfectly. The state of Buddhahood that we are striving for is that type of state. It has It entails being omniscient, which we kind of find mind-blowing, right? What is it like to have an omniscient mind? It's not a mind that can know everything. It's a mind that is knowing everything in every moment, knowing the minds of all sentient beings. And then the Buddha's mind isn't conceptual. The Buddha doesn't, kind of say, "Oh, what should I do today? Well, maybe I'll help Mary, and maybe I'll help, you know, um, June, and I'll help, this certain being and that being and what have you." The Buddha is spontaneously helping all beings all the time. This is kind of the power that Buddhists have. But of course, that power from the side of the Buddhas is unlimited. But you have to be in the right position to receive that. And that comes down to the individual karma of sentient beings. Some beings will receive it in magnificent forms. They say Lama Tsongkhapa received teachings from Manjushri, this, beautiful light being that appeared before him and taught him. Well, that's pretty amazing, right? It sounds pretty wild. But most of us are conditioned not to receive teachings in that way. We might receive teachings from His Holiness the Dalai Lama or these wonderful beings, but we don't have a karma to experience the teachings at a different level. So the Buddhas are continually doing everything that they can. This is what we mean by that state of fruition. The tree having fully developed, they are sending out all the time everything that is possible to benefit others according to their karma, helping them bit by bit to come closer and closer to enlightenment as well. But again, that's what the Buddhists do. The Buddhists can't enlighten us from their own side. They don't have that power. We've created our own situation. We are the ones that will dismantle it. We are the ones that have to take that initiative and do that. So we need both of these forces in order to accomplish that. We need to develop our wisdom very deeply, and we're going to see kind of uniting it. We're going to unite our compassion with two wisdom teachings that the Buddha gave, in addition to just the wisdom that understands our situation. And then we need to strengthen our compassion continually so that we don't lose that courage, that determination to be a benefit to others. Because it's very easy to lose. I mean, I'm always amazed. We have many people that come through the doors of our Buddhist centers, right? Not just this one, but around the world. And many people get very interested in it for a while, and then things kind of taper off and they kind of lose that ambition. I mean, it is kind of interesting that we have that phenomenon, but we understand it, right? This is a tough path. We're not talking about something really easy to do. If it was easy to do, we would have done it many, many lifetimes ago, right? Or even earlier in this life, it would have been like that. This takes a lot of effort in order to engage in this. So we need both of these forces behind it, not just this kind of blind compassion that just keeps generating compassionate thoughts but doesn't know how to actually get there. We need that wisdom that tells us how to get there, but of course that has to be guided by our compassion. So let's go ahead and let me see if there are any questions on this before I go on to the second and third types, which are really the main topic for today. Online, any questions, or in the Gompa? If you're in the Gompa, well, try to do the microphone. It should. Oh, they won't hear it, but I can. Okay. No questions? Everyone's on the same page? Okay, good. All right. So let me go back to that handout. This handout, again, just gives a little bit of an explanation for each of the other two as well. As I mentioned, there was the analogy of the bucket and the well. I'll just read that really briefly. Chandrakirti, by the way, Chandrakirti, his dates are somewhere around, I think, the 6th century of the Common Era, so quite a while ago. Chandrakirti uses the analogy of a bucket in the well to represent suffering sentient beings in psychic existence. Sentient beings and the bucket and the well have 6 features of similarity. So we meditated a little bit on that today, but if you want more on that detail, go to handout 3 of 4, the one that we used in the last class. The 3 types of compassion, the second one, we call compassion observing phenomena. But I want to say right up front that this is not compassion observing kind of flowers and things like that. It's observing sentient beings who are qualified by the nature of impermanence. That is a feature of almost all phenomena. Not everything is impermanent. And I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of what's permanent in Buddhism because it gets to be a little strange. But most of the things we deal with in our daily lives are impermanent. Impermanence is a pervasive feature of everything that arises from causes and conditions, which is, again, pretty much everything in our physical world, and then certainly even our mental world. Our minds arise from causes and conditions. Previous moments of mind give rise to the current moment of mind, right? And we have this whole chain of causes and conditions that goes back without any beginning. Well, because of the nature of those causes and conditions, everything is kind of infused with the quality of impermanence. Impermanence is referring to the fact that things change momentarily. Nothing stays the same moment by moment that is in this conditioned way, existing in that way. So, what is happening in this one? I'm going to give you a little explanation, then we'll go to the text and even look at the definition on the handout. But what is happening in this second type of compassion is that we're observing sentient beings and thinking about how, like all these other phenomena, sentient beings too are impermanent. They're changing moment by moment. Their bodies, their minds, the basis for that being continuing to change all the time. And yet, sentient beings tend to cling to the opposite. The Buddha says that this is one of our kind of grave misconceptions that we have. And of course, it becomes problematic, particularly when we start dealing with gross impermanence. The fact that this life doesn't last forever, that we are going to die and have to leave this life behind, which most people don't even want to think about, right? Gross impermanence is a subset of subtle impermanence. Subtle impermanence is the fact that things are constantly changing. I remember hearing that statistic the first was when I was quite young, that every 7 years, every single cell in your body has been completely replaced, right? You don't have any cells that you had 7 years ago, and then, of course, 7 years before that, and so on. Every 7 years, everything is different. And of course, many of those cells have changed multiple times during that time, right? But we have this view of like a single unchanging concrete body, right? Of course, it's hard watching the changes that happen as you get older and older, and the hair gets grayer, and the skin gets more wrinkly, and what have you, all these various things that happen. This is also, again, the grosser manifestations of that subtle impermanence that is going on all the time under the surface. Sentient beings cling to things as being unchanging, and yet it's in complete contrast to how things exist. I mean, look at how much consternation there was when we had to deal with even just changing our lifestyles when the COVID pandemic hit, right? I mean, all of a sudden, everyone's like making, plans, continuing to think, oh, I'm going to go on vacation in the summer and what have you. And meanwhile, everything around us is changing and we're refusing to change, many people, and say, no, I'm just going to keep having this view that everything's going to keep going the way I thought it was. And then the fact that we realized at some point we had to stop all of that uncertainty kind of reared its ugly head, right? Because we were no longer able to be convinced that everything was going to go in a particular way. It was going to go in a completely different direction. That's, impermanence. Things don't stay the same. That was a grosser manifestation of that, right? Where suddenly, things are completely different. Our lives, what have you, and things have, of course, changed on the basis of that in terms of the life that we're living right now, right? So again, this is something that sentient beings don't live with that knowledge. Well, when we observe sentient beings qualified in that way, we see that they are impermanent, changing moment by moment, and they are holding to the opposite. And this is a source of so much pain and suffering for them. If they were willing and able to, be aware of impermanence, their lives would be very different. I remember one teacher I had in San Francisco when I was beginning my Dharma path with Ling Center in San Francisco, Ngawan Chotak. He said that he traveled with a friend in Europe who used to refer to all of his possessions in the past tense. So he would say, "Oh, this was a nice wristwatch that I had." And these were nice clothes that I had. It might sound kind of strange. Maybe you don't want to hang around with that person for too long, but the idea is that if you start thinking about everything as being something that is going to be in the past tense at some point, right? Right? Because look at all the things that we've already had to let go at whatever age each of us are. We've already had to let go of a lot of stuff in this life, right? Things that, went out of our lives, people that went out of our lives, you know. Maybe our health has changed in drastic ways, whatever. All of these various things are the nature of existence, right? And if we hold on to that awareness and live our lives with that understanding, then we're not so upset when things change. We don't get so bent out of shape when suddenly it's something else. Remember, there's that story. I won't go into the whole story. The story of the Taoist farmer, Taoism. I don't know why it's Taoist. I mean, it could be Buddhist for all I know. But the idea is that he's a farmer, and one day his horse runs away, And so the neighbor goes over and says, "Oh, it's so sad. How awful that your horse ran away." And the Taoist farmer says, "Who knows what's good or bad?" The next day, the horse comes back with a wild horse. And so the neighbor comes over and sees he's got two horses now. He says, "Oh, how wonderful. How great. You have two horses." Farmer says, "Who knows what's good or bad?" The next day, his son is out there trying to break the wild horse and falls off the horse and breaks his leg. The neighbor comes over and says, "Oh, how bad that your son broke his leg." He says, "Who knows what's good or bad?" I'll say the last one anyway. The next day, the military come through and they're taking all the young men to go off to war. And of course, because his son has a broken leg, he doesn't go to war. So the neighbor comes and says, "How wonderful! Your son is still here. You can stay. He can stay home and not go to war." You get the gist of it, right? I mean, who knows what's good or bad if we have just that ability to accept that reality that things change. Remember another quote, Louis Richmond, who is a Zen teacher, in one of his books, he mentions he was a student of D.T. Suzuki. Suzuki Roshi was teaching one time, and he was saying a whole lot of things, and suddenly he got a hand up in the audience after talking for a while, and this person said, Roshi, you've been saying so many things. I haven't really understood a word of it. Can you say something to me that I'll actually understand? And Roshi said, "Everything changes." That was the simple words that he gave that we can understand. But this is the thing, is to try to live with that awareness. How do we live with that understanding that everything changes, that these bodies are constantly changing, that our world is constantly changing, that everything is in this process of flux and very, dynamic, not static like we think it is. We tend to hold to things and want them to be static. Maybe we don't, maybe we know this in the back of our minds. Yeah, everything changes, da, 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 but we want things to stay the same. We want to kind of get something that we can rely upon in this world of conditioned existence. And it's really not there to be found in that. Again, even when you're a Buddha, we would say a Buddha's mind is still impermanent, changing moment by moment, but it's no longer suffering in any way because of that. We suffer because we cling to the opposite. And we're going to see we suffer even greater when we get to the third level of compassion, when we unite it with a deeper level of wisdom. So let's take a look at the definition of this and kind of go through a little bit of the text. I don't want to spend too much time on the text today or the commentary that Lama Tsongkhapa wrote on this text. The definition of compassion observing phenomena: compassion in the continuum of a person who has already established by valid cognition the impermanence of sentient beings, having an aspect of wishing that the observed sentient beings qualified by impermanence be free from their suffering. So when we see and kind of unite it with that level of wisdom, we're observing those sentient beings, knowing that they are impermanent, that the world around them is impermanent, everything in this conditioned existence impermanent, and we understand that sentient beings suffer because they cling again to the opposite of that, and we want them to be free from suffering. We have that same quality of compassion. We even want to help them to be free from suffering, but we're uniting it with that understanding. The analogy that's used here by Master Chandrakirti, and it was in, let's go back to the verses, and actually forgot to do that for this one here. This is what we looked at in the last class, was verse 3, and then we'll go on to the first part of verse 4. Let's go ahead and recite this together. Homage to that compassion for migrators who are powerless like a bucket traveling in a well, through initially adhering to a self and I, and then generating attachment for things. This is mine. Homage to that compassion for migrators seen as evanescent and empty of inherent existence, like a moon in rippling water. So that verse 3 was again already alluding to why sentient beings are in that state, and we're going to see that the teachings on emptiness that we arrive at in towards the latter part of this class today really will undo that. It'll undo the knot of the rope that is holding them in samsara, in the well of existence. But the idea here in this verse 4, the first two lines, we actually see the two remaining levels. The second one we just talked about, where we're observing sentient beings qualified by their impermanence. And that's the part where we see that they are evanescent. They're as evanescent as a moon in rippling water. And the idea here is that if you were walking along, maybe it's kind of late at night or dusk or something, and you're walking in the woods, and maybe you haven't noticed that there's a full moon that's coming up or something, and you see a body of water, a big lake, and reflected in the lake is the moon, you know. And because it's a night with perhaps a breeze, the moon is rippling. It's constantly changing. You're seeing it on the surface of the water, but it's constantly rippling and changing. Well, this is how we're observing sentient beings in a similar way. See that they're continually in this process of flux, of change, nothing staying the same for even a moment. They cling again to the opposite. They're holding on to something that is contrary to the truth, contrary to reality. So this is the first part of this. The third one, we're going to come back to this and see how it's embedded in there as well. The idea of emptiness. And we're going to use the same analogy, though, of a moon in rippling water. Oops, there we were. That's where we need to be. Okay, this is where we're at. So again, let me go ahead and read a little bit of the text in order to illuminate the compassions, the second one, observing phenomena, and then the third one, compassion observing the unapprehendable, which we'll talk about shortly. From the viewpoints of the objects observed, Chandrakirti says what we just read, homage to that compassion for migrators, seen as evanescent and empty of inherent existence like a moon in rippling water. So Chandrakirti's homage to compassion observing phenomena is homage to compassion viewing migrators as evanescent or momentarily disintegrating, like a moon in water stirred by a breeze. So it's kind of, again, an interesting analogy because with this breeze, everything is constantly in flux. Of course, we don't see this, right? They say that subtle impermanence, you can gain a realization of it to where you actually are observant of that and have that awareness. But we don't see this, these flowers that are here, hold them up for the folks at home as well. These flowers are constantly changing. I mean, we know the grosser impermanence, right? That we come in, maybe you've left these on your table for a while and you went away for the weekend and then you come back and you see that the petals have all wilted and it's starting to be a little funky in the water and whatever. Everything's changed, right? Because we notice it when it has happened to a greater degree. But it's changing moment by moment. There's a process of kind of things arising, abiding, and disintegrating going on in regard to every atom of this thing. It's constantly changing. That's the nature of all these conditioned phenomena. It's the nature of sentient beings in terms of their bodies, their minds, everything in that state of perpetual change. Again, we don't think that way. We don't hold that awareness. And like I said, we do get really bent out of shape when things do change, especially if, like, it's the person that you're married to or in a relationship with, and suddenly they seem like a whole different person and they have different interests and different needs and different desires that maybe don't include you. And then all of a sudden you're trying to deal with that reality, right? That happens. Those are, again, grosser forms of change. But the reality is everything's in this constant state of change. So go back to the text just to look at a little bit more of that. But again, this is to try to hold that awareness so that when we look at sentient beings, we understand to some degree why they are suffering. So Chandrakirti's homage to compassion, observing the unhappy. Oh, this is the next one. I'm sorry, I don't want to go to that yet. What I want to do here, let me just introduce you to a little quote from His Holiness the Dalai Lama and from Venerable Children. First, I'm going to share one slide that's really a repeat of what you already saw in the text a short while ago. That's the what I just read there. It's the idea of the reflection of a moon in water stirred by breeze. I managed to find this nice little painting. That's actually a painting. No, that maybe that's a picture. I don't know. One of these is a painting, one is a picture. The one that I used for the third one, I think, is the painting now that I think about it. But if you have that full moon up above the water, you can see that again, it is in that state of constantly moving in the water, as well as, the wind that is stirring it. So His Holiness and Venerable Children say in their book, In Praise of Great Compassion, which I've quoted from a few times, they have a nice little commentary on this same praise that I'm teaching on. They say, considering the fact that sentient beings change moment by moment, like the reflection of a moon in water rippling in a breeze, wakes us up to a reality about our lives. There is no lasting or fixed security in samsara. Our bodies and minds, and therefore our identities and ourselves, are like the reflection of the moon in rippling water, changing in each moment. Again, but we cling so tightly, wanting everything to just stay still, stay in a place where, okay, I've got everything in place now. My life's okay. good relationships, good job, good whatever, and I want it to stay there. But everything's going to change. Guess what, folks? Observing that sentient beings grasp impermanent things as permanent and knowing that they suffer intensely because of this will stimulate compassion in our hearts. So this is the idea behind it, is that we use that wisdom, uniting it with our compassion, so that we gain a deeper degree of understanding why sentient beings are suffering. It's one thing, and compassion, I mean, Buddhism doesn't have a monopoly on compassion at all, right? Compassion and mercy are taught in every spiritual tradition. But the way that people look upon others with compassion will be different, right? Because the understanding of the causes of that are different. In Buddhism, it's this whole process that we're talking about. The first type of compassion, where we understand how the causes of suffering lead beings to go from life to life and have all these different unsatisfactory experiences. This second level, where we see that they're grasping at the permanence and thinking everything's going to somehow stay the same and not change. And that gives rise to a lot of consternation and difficulty. I mean, look at how much grief we have when people die. I'm not saying we shouldn't have grief. I think grief is a wonderful expression of our love for others. But a lot of our grief is caught up in the fact that we didn't think that was going to happen to them and then to us and losing them in our lives. Guess what, folks? It happens all the time. There's a wonderful quote from the Mahabharata where King Yudhishthira, I think I can't remember the name, but or Yamaraja maybe is the king. Anyway, he's talking and he says, "You know what the most wondrous thing is? The most wondrous thing is that all around us people can be dying and we don't think it's going to happen to us." This is the reality. Go read the obituaries every day. People our own age, people younger than us, all over the place. People are dying. But why do we think that's not going to happen to us? That's again a grosser form of impermanence, but it's part of this whole ballpark that we think that things are going to go on forever. We think that things are, not going to have that sort of change that is a grosser impermanence, and certainly not even change moment by moment. We want that reliability, that certainty, right? That's comforting to us. But if we open our eyes to that reality, then again, we are much more in tune with how things actually are. And when we observe sentient beings through that lens, then we understand a deeper form of their suffering, why they are in that state, why they continue to have that as a problem for them. The deeper level, of course, is where we get into, the real root of all of our problems, the misunderstanding that sentient beings have around their very nature. Let me go to the slides here first on this one. This is going to be repeated in regard to the third one. His homage to compassion, observing the unapprehendable. Unapprehendable meaning that you cannot apprehend an inherently existent sentient being. But yet beings cling to themselves as if they did exist in that way. And I'll give you an explanation of that shortly. So this is the kind of the homage to compassion, viewing migrators as empty of what we call inherent existence, though they appear to exist inherently, like the reflection of the moon in calm water. So the idea here is like this little painting that's down there at the bottom. It's a beautiful painting. I found it on the internet. I couldn't find an actual one with the moon kind of in a full state in the water as an actual photo. But here too, you might be wandering through the woods and you are not aware that the full moon's up above you. And then suddenly you see a lake and you see the surface of the water looking like the moon because the moon's reflection is fully there in the water. It's calm water on the lake, so it's not really having the quality of impermanence that we were talking about earlier, though of course it does, but it's just not as evident. But we have a moment where we mistake the reflection of the moon in the water for the actual moon. And you might think, well, how could you do that? But, sentient beings do a lot of wild stuff. They mistake a mirage for water. They mistake their own reflection for an actual person sometimes, right? We have a lot of ways that we have mistaken ways of seeing things. In this case, it's a reflection of a moon that we mistake for a real moon. Whereas the real moon is reflected down in it. But the idea is that reflection of a moon has no moonness whatsoever from its own side. It's only the reflection of a moon. What the Buddha says in this whole idea of what we mean by inherent existence is that we think that everything sets itself up. That when I hold up these flowers, for example, that there's flowerness and a sort of flower existence from the side of this stuff that I'm holding up here.
that the flowers exist on their own, independent as flowers, that everything that is flowerness about them is established from the side of that base, rather than being dependent upon the minds of beings. What the Buddha says in the end, we use this wonderful phrase, dependent arising or dependent origination, is that the subtlest way that flowers actually exist is that, yes, there's a base here. The Buddha does not say that there's nothing out here. That would be kind of wild. There is one set of the Buddha's teachings where he does kind of allude to that. And some people practice in what's called the mind only school, where they think everything is like a dream, that there's no real external reality. It's just a figment of our minds. Well, the Buddha in this final thought said, no, there is this stuff that's real out here. We can say that there's real kind of causes and conditions for flowers and so on, and these things come into existence. But in terms of its existence as a flower, being established as that, that's coming from the side of my mind. My experience and our mutual experience that we've collectively agreed to call this a flower. In French, it would be fleur, right? I mean, flora. And so and you have different ways that we could label this, but there's a concept around it that is this. I don't know what a definition of a flower is. Does anyone a botanist? I didn't look at my definition of a flower to work with today. But if you have, that definition of a flower, that's something we've all agreed upon to refer to this base, to this stuff here. This is particularly the chrysanthemum, isn't it? A mum, chrysanthemum, mum. It's my mummy. Um, so again, whatever label we put on, let's just call it flower for today. So the idea is that that label, that designation, that thought is coming from the side of beings. It's not coming from the side of here. And in fact, a bee would have a very different experience of this flower, right? Would call that's like a cafeteria for a bee or something, right? A restaurant. They don't use the term restaurant, but that's where they go to get their sustenance, and to get what they need, right? And of course, other beings would have a different relationship to it as well. Maybe there's beings again that would chew on the petals of the flower, and that would be a different way of relating to all of this base. Human beings are relating to it generally as flowers. Sometimes we might put flowers in salads or something. I've had that once. That was kind of weird. But the idea is that this is coming from the side of minds of beings. We conceptualize our world. And when it comes to the I, this person that we hold to so strongly, we have a lot of misconceptions in regard to this I. One of them is that permanence. We think there's a kind of permanent, unchanging I here. But the deeper error is that we think there's a real I here, and real meaning an I that is established on its own, from its own side, that has its own reality. I is just a label I give to this collection of body and mind. Body is a label I give to this collection of physical parts. Mind is a label I give to this stream of mental moments. And anything you go to, you find that it is merely labeled on a base. There's always a base. I mean, there has to be a base for us to establish that computer exists or flower exists or person exists. But once there's a base, then we label it, and then we think that it is that label. We think that the existence is from the side out here, as if flower was out there, already existing on its own, just waiting for us to experience it. Its flowerness is established out here, not by my mind. That's the error that we and sentient beings are making. That's what the emptiness teachings are all about, to say things are empty of existing in that way, self-established on their own, from their own side. This gets in kind of deep end stuff, but this is what we're doing in these levels of compassion. We're trying to unite our compassion with the wisdom understanding that sentient beings are clinging to all of these phenomena, and especially themselves, as if they existed in that way. And it's pure fiction. And of course, we can do the analysis to understand that there is no real I here. Think about how your sense of an I appears, especially if you've been accused of doing something that you didn't do. False accusations really bring this up, this strong sense of, I didn't do that. What are you accusing me of that for? That's not me. I would never do that. Okay, that's the tendency that we have to really strengthen that, feeling of I. But that thought of I is very, very subtle as well. It kind of plays a role in so many of our experiences.
It's kind of there, just waiting to pop up and to kind of adhere to that strong sense of the real I that we really believe is here. That's the biggest lie that we're telling ourselves, that we've been engaged in that lie since beginningless time. It's the root problem. It's the fundamental ignorance from which everything else comes. And if we don't address it, we never get out of the bucket, never gets out of the well. You never have any opportunity for your own freedom, much less attaining Buddhahood. So this is the deeper error, this conviction, this belief in a real I. I might mention how Lama Zopa goes about explaining how we perpetuate this. So we have a base, something that appears to us and that we label. And we learned the label for flower so long ago that I'm sure most of us don't even remember when we heard the first term flower to refer to this. And we're not just talking about language, by the way, because even before we have language, we have thoughts about things in our world. I'm imagining, again, I don't remember what it was like when I was an infant. But if we observe infant children, right, they are obviously interested in certain things that they have some idea about, right? Like mother's milk or mother herself and wanting to be close to mother. All of these various things, they begin to conceptualize and identify the world around them. And there's already error happening there. But when we get to language, there certainly is error happening. What Rinpoche says is that we first have a base that appears to us and we learn the label. Okay, so you all learned that this was flower, again, whatever type of flower it is. You learned that these are flowers. And so you got that first step. And if you stopped there, everything would be hunky-dory. But what happens in the second step, and what was alluded to in that passage I read, is that the flower now then appears to exist from its own side. This is the complication we have in realizing emptiness, is because everything appears as if it's self-established. The flowerness appears to exist out here. The shape of the petals and all of this, it screams flower from its own side. That's how it appears to us in that second step. First, we just learn the label, but because we have these imprints in our mind, it gives rise to a false appearance. It seems like flower is existing on its own out here. The third step is we don't even question it. We buy into it. We're like, do we agree with it completely, 100%? Now, again, most beings are not even questioning it, right? They're only involved in the first two. Well, they're involved in all three steps, but they're not even aware that they are committing the third step. The third step is where we have to start. We have to say, I have to stop buying into reality existing in the way that it appears, which sounds kind of like loony bin stuff, right? We normally commit people who don't agree to reality in the way that it appears. The Buddha says that everything is appearing in this false way. There's a conventional appearance that we can find is okay. Yeah, we understand where flowers come from and how our bodies need sustenance and all these various things involved in causes and conditions. But when it comes to their mere appearance, they seem to be existing from their own side. And that's false. It's 100% false. And it's a product of our ignorance. It's sort of a byproduct. Because we've had this ignorance since beginningless time, everything appears as if it's real. It's like the moon reflected in the water that we think is a real moon. It's just a reflection. It's just arising through various causes and conditions. It has no moonness from its own side. There's a wonderful example. Maybe I'm throwing too much philosophy out today, but an example that Chandrakirti uses, Lama Tsongkhapa has it in his text. I think it's in Chandrakirti's text as well, though. It's kind of a dark time of day, like again around dusk, and you walk outside and you see suddenly this something that appears to be a snake. It's like a coiled rope that, due to the conditions of the dark, seems to be a snake. And for a moment, you have that, oh, there's a snake. But then, of course, you notice that it isn't really moving, and maybe you get a flashlight and you shine it and you go, no, it's just a rope. It might be a striped rope or something that has some things that qualities that you think are a snake. What Lama Tsongkhapa says is that in the same way that there is no snake on that coiled rope, there's also no snake on what we actually call a snake. The snakeness doesn't exist from the side of the snake, and yet conventionally we will still call that a snake and call that a coiled rope. But there's no real snake on the side of those parts of a snake, the little tongue and the head and the body and the tail and whatever, all of that. There's no real snake there, in the same way that there's no real snake on the coiled rope, which again is kind of mind-blowing. But these things appear to have their own reality. They appear to have snakeness and even coiled ropeness. Coiled rope exists as coiled rope, but it doesn't exist as a snake. But nothing exists as what it appears. Yeah. Yes, conventionally we can call this a flower, but it has no flowerness from its own side. Flower is a quality, a way, a label that, kind of talk about these things, give us some conventional agreement. So when we get to the store and we say, I'd like some flowers, people know what we're asking for, right? We use language and conceptuality to organize our world and to deal with all of that. But as was pointed out in the way Rinpoche was, alluding to how things become problematic, we think our world is organized from its own side that way. We think that all of this was just waiting there to be identified by us as whatever it is that we've labeled it. So again, the biggest problem, I mean, yes, flowers can become problematic or other things, snakes, what have you. But the biggest problem is clinging to this I as if it's real, as if there's a real me here. Because on the basis of this real me, we then get into defense mode with this me and think that we have to protect it to make sure it gets what it wants, to please it, to take care of it, and keep everything else that's going to harm it out of harm's way. And some of that makes some sense in a conventional way, but we are clinging so tightly to this I that it causes us to engage in all kinds of misbehavior. I mean, look at what's going on in our country right now. There's a lot of this kind of clinging to an identity of who we are and what have you, and being so convinced of who that is that we even ostracize other people and even harming other people in the process of that. This is what is happening to each of us, and it's happening to every single sentient being who's under the control of these factors. They continue to believe in this real I and act from that place. The first step is to undermine that real I, that belief in something that is false. I sometimes use the example of if you had a child who was having, couldn't go to bed at night because this child was convinced that there was a monster in the closet, right? There's a monster in my room. I can't get to bed because I'm so afraid of it. Well, when you're observing this being who's believing, this young child believing in a monster that you know is non-existent, well, then your compassion is even greater, right? Because you know that they could be removed from that so easily by just coming to understand that the monster doesn't exist. And so you out of your compassion, you go into the room before they go to bed and you get a big flashlight and you shine it in every corner of the closet and even under the bed and anywhere else where they might think there's a monster. And you show them that there is no monster. And over time, hopefully they get the message and they sleep better and they have more peace because they're not disturbed by the thought of a real monster that's actually fake, that's actually not there at all. This is what I think is this compassion is akin to. We are having the understanding ourselves, and again, I'm not going to go into all the techniques of realizing emptiness ourselves. We teach those regularly, and those are a part of this tradition. We undermine our own belief in that real I. And then when we observe other beings, they're like the child who believes in something that is totally fake, totally false. And they're suffering because of it. And so when we see that, we realize their suffering is really quite unnecessary. If only they had the wisdom to undermine that false conception, they wouldn't be believing in that at all, and they wouldn't be suffering at all. They'd remove all of that and they'd be free. And of course, that's one level of progress the Buddha teaches, and then they could even go on to become this magnificent being, this Buddha, and help other beings. There's that quote, I may have shared it earlier in December, but a quote from Kunu Lama Rinpoche. Kunu Lama Rinpoche taught His Holiness the Dalai Lama the text by Shantideva, which many of us have as a very dear text in our tradition. Shantideva himself was an Indian Buddhist master of the 8th century who wrote the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. There's just really precious teachings in there. So Kunu Lama really embodied all of this, and His Holiness often speaks very fondly of Kunu Lama Rinpoche. I think even Lama Zopa Rinpoche has taught a number of times. There's a book out on the table there, Nectar of Bodhicitta, where he talks about Kunu Lama Rinpoche's verses in praise of bodhicitta. This is what Kunu Lama said. It's this simple. Whoever we encounter did either realize reality or did not. By reality, we mean they did realize emptiness, that things don't exist in this false way. So this is true, right? Anyone we meet, any being we meet, They've either realized emptiness or they haven't. I can tell you I'm in the latter category. I haven't. I've got some conceptual understanding of it, but I'm not in that camp yet. Every being we meet is one of those two. If they did realize reality, he says, they stand on their own wisdom and are objects of veneration. Right? Maybe we do have those beings, and we like to think, certainly, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, all these wonderful teachers, they may say, well, oh, I've got a little bit of wisdom, but I don't have that realization. But we can understand certainly that if that's the case, if somebody that we meet has realized emptiness, prostrate to them. They're an object of veneration. How wonderful. They've freed themselves from that knot. Secondly, if they did not realize emptiness, realize reality, then they are immersed in suffering and are objects of compassion. Thus, nobody is a valid object of anger or derogation, and nobody can ever be abandoned from our hearts. I mean, when you look at sentient beings in this way and you understand that whoever they are, I mean, whether you talk about Trump or Biden or Obama or Bush or whoever at that level, if you talk about anyone we meet in our daily life, any people that are in our family, friends, whatever, every being tends to probably fall into that latter category, right? They might be beings who have realized emptiness and we should prostrate at their feet, but they're probably beings who have not realized this truth yet, who are still under the control of that delusion, who are still making decisions in their lives and acting out of that ignorance and causing their own suffering by virtue of that. So we should have compassion for them. And neither of these camps, if it's somebody who's realized emptiness or hasn't, are objects of anger or derogation or any kind of negative thoughts. And in fact, really, we should just have a mind of compassion that embraces all beings, because we don't know who has these realizations or not, right? So we just look at every sentient being and we understand through this logic of what we have learned in Buddhism why beings are in the predicament that they are, which we talked about when we did the analogy of the bucket and the well. And we understand that the root cause is this ignorance, that grasp at that reality that is totally false. You know, believing in a real me that doesn't exist. So then we have a different level of compassion. Our compassion becomes even stronger because once more we realize that it can be totally undone, not just the suffering that comes from grasping at permanence, but the suffering that is arisen from that ignorance that includes everything, all suffering, all dissatisfaction. Let's see what His Holiness and Venerable Chodron say about this in their commentary on it. They said, sentient beings lack true existence. This is another phrase we use: true existence, inherent existence, substantial existence, independent existence, existence from their own side. Anyway, I won't go through the whole list of synonyms for that. Yet, unaware of this fact, they continue to grasp themselves and all other phenomena as truly existent and generate afflictions that bind them in samsara. Seeing sentient beings as qualified by being empty of true existence and knowing that they suffer due to grasping themselves and everyone and everything around them as truly existent entities, bodhisattvas generate strong compassion, wanting sentient beings to be free from ignorance, afflictions, and polluted karma, and all the dukkha that these cause, all of the states of unsatisfactory experience that they cause. The suffering of pain, that dukkha that is very evident, the dukkha of change, that even the pleasant experiences aren't lasting, and then that pervasive conditioned dukkha, that state of being under the control of these factors. So this is kind of what we're working on developing with this third level of compassion. I might mention that, there was a meditation I put together. I think I pulled that up. I hope I did. Maybe I didn't. No, I don't think I did. Sorry. Anyway, it's out there on the um, website in the materials folder that you have for this course. There's a little meditation that goes into these three. I actually have it here in front of me. Anyway, it's about 4 pages because it deals with the first one for a couple of pages, the second one, the third one. You can practice it. You can work with these. Now, again, to meditate on the second two that we covered today, you do have to have some of that intellectual understanding. You do have to have the wisdom that supports that. Otherwise, it doesn't really have the juice to it. But if you really get that impermanence is a fact that we are dealing with and have come to that reasoning conclusion, that logical conclusion, and then you do understand why sentient beings are suffering to some degree. But when you get this deeper understanding of emptiness, that combats the deepest ignorance that sentient beings have, then you get an even more profound level of compassion. Because you understand, once more, I use that phrase frequently, that sentient beings are suffering needlessly, really. All of us are suffering needlessly. If we just got it, if we just put the energy and time into realizing, this wisdom, we could undo our own situation, and moreover, we could become qualified to help others to do the same. So, in this way, we see that, again, compassion and wisdom kind of unite and even work in tandem with each other. Our compassion becomes even more kind of strong and solid and grounded in the reality that, yes, this can be the cure for all this can be effected. Absolutely. The third noble truth, without a doubt, for every sentient being, they can be free from all of this if they, again, follow the path which primarily is rotating around developing that wisdom, that deepest wisdom of emptiness. Let me share just a few more quotes and then I want to open it up to questions. I would have gone back and done more of the text if this had been back in December when I wasn't so well, but let's go to a quote from Jeffrey Hopkins, I believe, next. He says, so you can see then the compatibility of emptiness and compassion, wisdom and compassion, these two concepts. It's most certainly not the case that Buddhists become compassionate and then, upon understanding emptiness, neglect everything. It's not like, oh, everything's empty. I hear this from Buddhist students sometimes. Everything's empty. Doesn't matter then. It's like, no, that's not what emptiness is saying. Emptiness is saying everything arises in this way. That's why we need to be meticulous and care for how things are arising through causes and conditions and create the proper causes and conditions that lead to the result that we seek. It all arises within emptiness. It always has arisen within emptiness. Everything has always happened within emptiness. We just are blind to that reality. We've been buying into ignorance. So then he goes on to say, realization of emptiness is a tool for the enhancement of compassion. And further, it is a tool for the development of a mind that will be able to bring about the welfare of beings, because one will no longer be deceived by their nature. We understand that these sentient beings are not real in the way that they appear to us, even. Death is not real in the way that it appears to us. Nothing is real in the way that it appears to us. So we lose our own kind of being deceived by those false appearances, and we are able to benefit others to an even greater degree. With wisdom and compassion working together, he says, feelings of empathy and commiseration are built on the strength of valid realization of the nature of persons and things. And analytical intelligence is warm to the feelings of both oneself and others. So don't think that this idea, I mean, we hear emptiness, and of course, emptiness, the way it's used in our culture, it's sounding like this kind of place of there's no meaning and whatever. Emptiness is referring here again quite specifically to a way things don't exist. When it doesn't become cold when we realize that, it actually makes us open up to the connection to others, makes us understand that the situation they are in is exactly our through the force of recognizing that ignorance that is operative in both ourselves and others. So our heart opens up even more. That's why it's said that actually bodhisattvas, who we call them sharp faculty, meaning they kind of want to know that there's a solution to all of this before they commit to, I'm going to become a Buddha for all sentient beings, right? That's a nice thought. But they want to kind of be able to say, yes, and I understand how I can actually do that. Well, those sharp faculty bodhisattvas come to understand emptiness before they generate bodhicitta. They don't generate maybe the deepest realization of it, but they know that this is why sentient beings are suffering, and they know that it can be removed. So they know that that is an effective process to engage in because it's not just a pipe dream. Oh, I'm going to become a Buddha and then help all sentient beings to become a Buddha, and I hope that falls into place and we find the causes and conditions to do that. If they investigate emptiness, then they know how that can be effective. They know that the cure can be achieved because they've seen that reality to some degree for themselves. So that's the idea behind this and what kind of makes it very effective. And I hope I've conveyed that in the teachings I've given. I'm going to close with just, well, actually, there's a little bit more from Jeffrey, sorry. For the time being, these two sides have to balance each other. But in the end, compassion and wisdom are so intertwined that they are indistinguishable. Other concern makes happy sense. His Holiness often says this, right? The way to be wisely selfish is to actually care for others and to be dedicated to their welfare. So if we unite this compassion with that wisdom, well, then we see the sense of that, that actually this is the best way to kind of attend to our own needs, is to be genuinely concerned about the needs of others and develop our minds in that direction. This is the final quote, sorry, from His Holiness and Venerable Children, right at the end of their section where they discuss this praise. Chandrakirti's homage to great compassion is most precious and profound. I hope you feel joyful in learning about it and will keep it in your heart as an invaluable treasure. So with their words, we can certainly hopefully take that to heart. And then I put wonderful Rinpoche on the screen with that quote that we have from him, that he made: live with compassion, work with compassion, meditate with compassion. When problems come, experience them with compassion, die with compassion, enjoy with compassion. Practicing this gives you the best happy life. It fulfills all your wishes and all living beings' wishes for happiness. I love that picture of Rinpoche. Okay, so let's see if there are any questions. Again, oops, that's not where I wanted to go. I wanted to stop that. Any questions or comments? Yes, please, Mark. Let's get the microphone to Mark. I think it should work, I would hope. Well, we'll at least have it amplified here, and maybe they'll hear a bit through the microphone on my, maybe I can point it at Mark.
Um, I have great difficulty balancing this dichotomy of yes, it exists, it has an inheritism, and no, it's empty of inherent existence, and inheritance is an illusion, an illusion.
Hmm.
And the way um, make the whole thing, how I say it, harmonize, is that I think that reality is real. We all know it's real, okay? But what it's real, what it is a user manual.
Is a what?
A user manual.
Oh, okay.
That we created since we were born. And that's it. That's, it's a real story. But story is not quite right, because it's a useful story. We use it, we need it, and it's also full of errors, and we make some mistakes. But it is the real thing. But it's not the real thing. It's the real user manual, and in that sense, it is empty of inherent existence. That's how I deal with it.
Okay. Well, it's an interesting perspective. I think most people heard that online. Yes? No? No. It's kind of hard for me to repeat all, but Mark's idea was that when we look at kind of this world of appearance that is all kind of seeming to be inherently existent, that is sort of a user manual was the words that you use, user manual for our being in this world. And yes, there's the emptiness of everything, but you need to kind of balance those two and find a way to incorporate that. And this user manual idea is the way of working with that. Well, I mean, we do say that we need the conventional reality as a basis upon which to do all the other aspects of the path. In fact, when we talk about these two wings, the wisdom wing is primarily preoccupied with what we call ultimate truth, the final truth of how things actually exist, their lack of inherent existence. The conventional aspect of the compassion wing is where we say, yes, there are sentient beings and I have compassion for them. And there are all the other elements of the path, and karma and everything else that we learn. All of that supports the other side. So you don't really ever have these two completely removed from each other. Again, and anything that we posit that has a conventional existence also has its ultimate existence. And in a sense, we do have to use, that's our user manual kind of way of looking at it, which I think is a nice way to observe it. We have to use the conventional world in order to get to all of this. I mean, there's that wonderful analogy of the lotus. Lotus will grow only in kind of the muckiest parts of the water. It's like really dirty and nasty and whatever, but it rises up above the water and then blooms unsullied by all of that mud. Well, we kind of need the mud of samsara. We need all of this stuff that we're swimming in, all of this being in relationship with other beings, navigating this whole world and what have you. We need all of that as the stuff from which this lotus of enlightenment will bloom. If you don't have all of that stuff, you can't get that. Thich Nhat Hanh wrote a book. I was so jealous of the title. It was so wonderful. No mud, no lotus. You know, if you don't have the mud, you don't get the lotus. So you need samsara and nirvana, kind of that state of freedom from all of this that can be even in Buddhahood. You need those two as kind of they're part and parcel of the same thing in a sense. You're just looking at kind of a different side. The experience of our world that's a nirvanic experience is when you're free of all that. The samsaric experience is when you're still with all of that. But it's the same fundamental world in a way. I mean, it doesn't have that reality from its own side. So I think you're pretty on target with that comment, Mark. Yeah. Any others? We have just a few minutes left, perhaps. A comment or question? I want to give a shout out to Lou. Hi, Lou. Lou's waving to all of us. We miss you here at the community, but glad you're being taken well care of. Yeah. So anyway, anyone else? Anything? So just to echo His Holiness and Venerable Children's words, I mean, I really do hope that you find these verses inspiring. Again, you've got the copy of the verses, all of this that are out there on the materials link. Please feel free to print those out, work with the meditation. If you ever have the chance to study this whole text, Venerable George Turnoff is teaching Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary on this. He's been going on for quite some time, I think. It's a very advanced text, but it really is so amazing in terms of the ability to really deeply investigate the topic of emptiness in particular. But obviously, Chandrakirti was not just singling that out. He was right from the beginning wanting us to unite that understanding, everything we develop on this wisdom path of Buddhahood, to never let it be parted from our compassion, to let it enhance our compassion, so that we have deeper and deeper regard for the welfare of all sentient beings and eventually become a Buddha for their sake. So that's the idea. Okay, so we're going to do some dedication. We might bring to mind beings who we're dedicating for. Certainly, there's a prayer list here that includes a number of beings. I don't know, were you going to read that? Do we read that normally? No. We'll probably read it at the puja on the 18th, but we can think about those beings, all those beings who are on that prayer list, as well as any prayer list, beings who need our prayers, certainly those in our own lives, but also in parts of the world where there's great suffering and strife. And then, of course, to extend this really to all sentient beings, and we'll dedicate using Master Shantideva's text, these verses from the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life that I mentioned earlier. Okay. Get those on the screen. Thank you, Sheila. Go ahead, Mary, if you want to lead us in that.
May all beings
Everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, till then may I too remain, to dispel the miseries of the mind.
And then a long life prayer for His Holiness, as well as all of our other teachers. Gandhi Rawe Korwe Shinkandir and Dewa Shonwe
Chenres, Tenzi, Gyalso.
Shape Site Vati Tengyur Shri.
And we also dedicate for everything to be auspicious for finding Lama Zopa Rinpoche's reincarnation, our spiritual director, so we can once more be under his amazing guidance in whatever form he takes in this next existence. We want everything to be auspicious for him to be raised in a way so that his great wisdom, compassion will shine forth in that being's presence in this world. Okay, thank you all for coming today for these teachings. I'll be here again next Sunday and of course continue on the Wednesday nights. But then I'll be heading off to California for a month to teach at our centers there. So anyway, miss all of you then, but look forward to seeing you next Sunday, hopefully. All right, be well. Thank you. Thank you, Shayla. Thank you, Mary.